Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Well, it's 2:01, and I know we have a lot to share like we did last time. So, welcome again. My name is Lisa Reed. I'm the Chief Learning Officer for the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. And we also have Leslie Morales here helping me with tech and assisting with chat to help answer any questions that you may have. We're delighted to have you join us for this is our second presentation of going over financial terms with the Nonprofit Guide to Sustainable Success, Mastering Governance and Fiduciary Duty. So we welcome you, and this will be presented by Jackie McLaughlin, a CPA with Technical Reviews and Training Manager. But before I go on, I want to give you a little brief history about the center. Our mission is to educate, connect, and advocate for North Carolina nonprofits. It's important for the center to assist nonprofits to build organizational practices that address the nonprofit leadership gap while lifting up equity, diversity, and inclusion in all nonprofits. Just a few housekeeping items. Yes, today's webinar will be recorded and we'll send it out with our wraparound email and additional resources as needed. You may use the chat box, as I mentioned earlier, for questions or anything that you want to share with the group. We'll make sure we're monitoring it. And please take a few minutes to look at our post-session survey. So that will be helpful as we go through. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jackie, because I know we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I'm going to let you get started.
Thanks, Lisa. So let me
Sure.
start by sharing my screen. Okay, Lisa, when you can see that, just
Yeah,
let me
you're
know.
good.
Okay,
Hmm.
you can. Okay, so I will put it on a bigger view so everybody can see better. There, perfect.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. As Lisa said, my name is Jackie McLaughlin and I'm with Chazen. We're an outsourced accounting firm. So if you have an accounting staff and they need a little, as I call it, spotter in a gym, we can do that. We can take over everything. It's very a la carte services. So that said, today we're going to talk about mastering governance and fiduciary responsibility. I'm very excited about this topic, which sounds a little nuts. What? You love governance and fiduciary? But I'm excited about this topic because people don't understand fiduciary responsibility. And in the nonprofit world, people particularly don't understand that they've got some fiduciary responsibility. So we're going to talk about that today. Here's our learning objectives. We're going to learn what fiduciary responsibility means, what your liability is. Many people don't know that they have a liability. Get you familiar with the financial responsibilities and decode that word you may have heard or that phrase you may have heard, internal controls. And then absolutely will get you to understand your responsibility for tone at the top and what that means. So that said, we'll start with fiduciary responsibility. So you can see this quote from Nonprofit Law. Board members have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the organization. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time that the first couple of slides are a lot of legal jargon because I have to say it, but just stick with me through the legal jargon and then we're going to interpret what that legal jargon really means. Oh, I'm wrong. We're interpreting it right now. So, of what fiduciary responsibility really is, it's like being a parent. So, what the heck am I talking about? So, anybody on this call who's a parent, doesn't matter if your children are grown or if they're young or anywhere in between, you know that you have made no decisions in your household that have not taken into account your children. So the example that I love to give is, again, when your children were minors, if you had had a job opportunity across the country from where you live, maybe a better opportunity for your career, once you became a parent, you didn't just take that opportunity. You stopped and you thought about how it would impact your children and if it was the best move for them. And you may have decided to take it, or you may not have if you determined it wasn't in the best interest of your children. Fiduciary responsibility as a board member or a decision maker in a nonprofit. So you don't have to be the executive director or the president. You just need to be a decision maker and you have fiduciary responsibility. So what it is it's putting the organization first. So drawing it back to my analogy about parent and children, when you're a decision maker in a nonprofit, you're the parent and the nonprofit is the child. You have three primary duties, and this is the legal jargon. You have a duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. So your duty of care is about making good decisions. So again, let's compare that to being a parent. If you wanted a Maserati, but having a Maserati means that your children won't eat anything for a year, you're not getting that Maserati. You would have all chosen to feed your children first. That's good judgment. And as a decision maker in a nonprofit, you have to use that level of good judgment with respect to the organization at all times. If any of you on here are board members, this might be something, the next item, this might be something that you see with fellow board members. Now, if you're staff, you are definitely devoting sufficient time and effort to issues. But oftentimes, nonprofits have a largely volunteer board. And in any board, there's those few members who maybe only show up once a year, don't really engage. They are not upholding their duty of care, which is part of their fiduciary responsibility. You also have to avoid conflicts of interest, which I'm going to set aside just for a minute because we're going to see this expression come up a couple more times, and then I'll explain what it is. And as your duty of care, sometimes you have to be able to identify that you might not have the expertise in-house to deal with the issues, and so you might need to contract it out and rely on experts. Part of your fiduciary responsibility is a duty of loyalty. So again, you have to act in the best interest of the organization, even if you're not an executive director or a board member, but if you're a decision maker. There is that word conflict of interest again. You have to avoid conflict of interest. Maintain confidentiality. So again, this is like your children. When your children become teenagers and they have very real problems, you don't go out to your friends and neighbors and talk about your, or better yet, your teenagers' friends. You don't go around talking about your children's serious problems that they may have. You maintain the confidentiality of your children, and that's what you need to do with your nonprofit. And then again, you must diligently fulfill your duties, attend meetings, review materials, and actively participate in the governance. And finally, you have a duty of obedience. Now, oftentimes when I give this presentation, I always get pushback. People say, I hate that word obedience, Jackie. Well, I do too, but it's the legal word, so I have to say it. You have a duty of obedience, which means making sure that what your organization does is aligned with its mission. Example, if your organization's mission is to feed homeless people, the executive director, because I know how they are, they're very passionate about their missions and they get 1,000 great ideas a second. They might come to the board and go, oh my gosh, the homeless people need shelter as well. Well, if you're a decision maker, it's your responsibility to say, that's a good idea, but no, it's not consistent with our mission, which in my example is to feed homeless people, not shelter homeless people. You have to act in good faith in the best interest of the organization. And finally, you need to make sure that you're complying with laws and bylaws. So I love this one as well. It directly relates to parenting. As a parent, you tell your children, don't break the law. But more importantly than telling your children, you demonstrate that. Nobody on this call is going out breaking probably any laws other than that occasional speeding ticket. So on the whole, every day you're demonstrating to your children that you're upholding the law. You're of course telling them not to break the law. And that's how you're setting the example. As a nonprofit decision maker, you have to set the example for your organization to comply with its bylaws and its laws. It's important to understand that as a decision maker, you have liability if you don't uphold your duties, those three duties we talked about. You can be held personally liable for damages caused by your wrongful act or omissions. Your best defense from being held personally liable is to understand your responsibilities, which is what we're covering today, and to ensure that your organization follows the laws and bylaws. Your organization should also have directors and officers insurance, which is a way to help insure you against any liabilities brought against you for alleged wrongful acts or omissions. Many nonprofits think that they can't afford officers and directors, or we call it D&O insurance. But to give you an example, we had a very small client that had about $200,000 a year in revenue. Their D&O insurance ran about $1,100. So it's affordable and it's very worth it. On the other hand, we had a client come to us a little too late, sadly, where their board of directors were being sued for poor decision making, and the board didn't even know that the organization never had D&O insurance. So the board was hanging out on a limb on their own on that one. So I want to get back quickly now that you understand your legal liabilities. I want to get back to that idea about conflict of interest because it's an important one as a decision maker. And I'm going to give you examples to best illustrate what conflict of interest is. And I'm going to give you a good example, and I'm going to give you a bad example. So I'm going to start with bad example so we can end with the good example on a little more positive note. So really what conflict of interest means is that you can't act in your best interest. You have to act in the organization's best interest. And typically your organization will have a conflict of interest policy that board members and decision makers should sign every year. Bad example was prior to coming to Chazen, I was a CFO for a private college, and we had large investments. And a member of the board came in my office one day, threw a bunch of papers down in front of me, demanded that I sign them because he was moving the investments that we had from vehicle A to vehicle B. And there were all kinds of things wrong with this. The first thing wrong being we had an investment committee to make those decisions. So it wasn't something I could have done even if I wanted to. But secondly, although I'm not an investment person, I knew enough to know that where he wanted to put us was in his best interest, not ours. It was a very high commissioned investment vehicle. And I forgot if I said this, but he was a member of the board. So he continued to come into my office multiple times a week and slam my desk and try and be a bully and all of that negative stuff. And I try to be a nice person, but when you bully me, I dig my heels in. So he didn't get very far. He ultimately had to go to the investment committee, which was the appropriate road to go. And they voted not to move the investment money because it wasn't in the college's best interest. So that's a bad example of conflict of interest. A good example is that coming to work for Chasen, we had a client. The chairman of the board was a real estate developer. This client was in a high cost of living urban area, and the organization, the nonprofit, needed to lease parking spaces, about 50 parking spaces a month. So the chairman of the board said, "Hey, I lease out parking spaces. I'll be happy to lease the organization parking spaces for $14,000 a month." But then what the chairman of the board did was appropriate behavior. He gave the staff a quote and he told the staff to go get other quotes from his competitors. So they did. At the next board meeting, the chairman of the board presented the issue. They needed to rent 50 parking spaces. He presented his company's quote, $14,000 a month, and then he left the room and recused himself from the vote. When he left the room, the staff members told the rest of the board about the competitors' quotes, which, by the way, were right around $14,000 a month. So the board voted to give the chairman of the board the contract. Again, he wasn't in the room, he didn't vote, and all of this was documented in the minutes. So he did get the contract. But in that case, even though he was the chairman of the board and now he's got a $14,000 a month revenue stream off the organization, it was not a conflict of interest. It had gone through all the right methodology to approve it. So this slide is all about reducing your legal risk. And we just talked about how you are legally responsible as a decision maker. So you have to be familiar with the financials. You have to understand internal controls in your organization, set the proper tone at the top. And as part of internal controls, this ensure part is really part of the you part, understand, ensuring that no single person has too much power or control over financial transactions is a branch off good internal controls. So Leslie or Lisa, before I move on, any questions in the chat or anything like that?
Not as of yet. You're good.
We're good. Okay.
Mhm.
So, as part of your fiduciary responsibility, you have to be familiar with your financial responsibilities. So, one of the things that's important is to have some financial literacy. That doesn't mean you have to be an investment person or an accountant. It really means you have to have some common sense with respect to money. And then, if we go to the right, uh, as a nonprofit leader, you need to be familiar with financial planning and budgeting. And nobody likes that word budget, but in a couple of slides, we're going to make that a little less awful. You need to understand the financial statements. And also, you have a responsibility for risk management, meaning doing what you can to make sure that your nonprofit organization is insured, and I don't mean literally insured, although that's part of it, but that your nonprofit can protect itself against large losses. There we go. So some of your key oversight responsibilities are to approve financial policies and procedures, monitor financial performance, approve the annual budget, select and oversee the auditor if your organization is required to have an audit, and make sure that your organization has financial transparency. As a nonprofit, everybody should be able to see your financials at any period of time. So some of you maybe have some for-profit experience, and in for-profit, particularly in for-profits that aren't on the stock exchange, financial data is held close to the vest. You have 1, 2, 3 owners. They can make any financial decisions they want, and they don't have to be transparent with it. But when you're a decision maker and a fiduciary in a nonprofit, nonprofits don't have that ability to hold their financial information close to the vest. They have to be transparent. So part of your budgeting and financial planning responsibilities are to, if you're a board member, you've got to review the annual budget. So usually the staff is actually putting it together. But as a board member, you've got to review it for reasonableness. That doesn't mean you have to understand generally accepted accounting principles. That doesn't mean you need to know the words debits and credits. It means none of that. Here's what it means. If you live in a household and you live with a partner, and your partner comes to you with the budget for 2026, hey, here's what we make, here's what we spend. In your home, when your partner comes to with a budget, you can look at rent or mortgage expense that he or she budgeted at $1,000 for a year. And you can look at this and go, that's not reasonable. We don't pay $1,000 a year for mortgage or rent, whatever your expense is. That's what I'm talking about, bringing that same level of common sense to your organization that you bring to your personal finances when you're looking at how much you spend. Here's another example. If your personal credit card bills are starting to inch up, and the next thing you know, they might be $4,000 a month, common sense tells you what the heck is happening here. What are we spending $4,000 a month on? So chances are you're getting those credit card bills, you're looking at them intently, you're figuring out where the waste is and what you can stop spending money on. Maybe you've got some subscriptions automatically going through your credit card that you don't even use anymore. In other words, you're bringing common sense to your personal credit card bill. And that's exactly what you have to bring to your nonprofit and to looking at the budget that this staff will prepare. When I worked for a different nonprofit, the executive director was the most brilliant person I've ever worked with. But every year at the budget, she would bring these gigantic ideas forward that she wanted to put in the budget. And by gigantic, I mean lots of money, big investment. And those board members would look at her and go, well, we love the idea, but how are you going to fund it? That's a question that a reasonable person can ask. You don't need to know accounting and you don't need to know debits and credits. One thing that nonprofits are discovering with everything going on in Washington, D.C., is that you need to diversify your funding sources. So let's go back to talking about your personal money. If you've got personal savings and you deal with a professional financial advisor, they will always tell you to diversify your portfolio. So what that means for your personal life is if you compare investment returns to go to miles per hour, 5 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, 120 miles an hour, your investment advisor will advise you to spread your money amongst all three of those miles per hour buckets to protect yourself against any huge ups or downs and still make a decent amount of money along the way. Your nonprofit's the same way. If you just rely on federal grant funding, well, guess what? Probably right now you're a little bit stressed out because you might not get your federal grant funding. So if you're a board member of a nonprofit and you notice that your organization is overly dependent on one funding source, whether that be a grant or even oftentimes nonprofits are dependent on one particular donor who gives a large amount of money every year. If that's the boat that you're in, you want to talk to your organization and the leadership within your organization and figure out ways that you can diversify your revenue stream.
Quick, I'm sorry. Can
Again,
can I interrupt you, Jackie? I'm sorry.
yep,
I
please.
thought I didn't know you were going to another sentence. We have one question that's saying when you were speaking about transparency, are you speaking to the board or public?
Everybody,
Okay,
like
right. To all.
financial performance in a nonprofit has to be available to everybody. And it is because when push comes to shove, even if you don't need an audit, all nonprofits have to file a 990, which is a nonprofit version of a tax return. So some of you are probably thinking, why do you have to file a tax return? We don't pay any taxes. We're a nonprofit. True, but that 990 return is largely informational, and it is a matter of public record. If any of you are familiar with GuideStar, you can go to GuideStar right now. You don't even need a paid subscription, and you can look up any nonprofit you want to, and it will show you the most recent 990 that the IRS has uploaded to GuideStar. Charity Navigator's another one. So by definition, at least your tax returns are available to anybody who wants to search for them. So you should be financially transparent with all. And finally, as a decision maker, you need to remember that every decision you're making is for your long-term sustainability. And here's what I mean by that. First of all, nonprofits think they can't make a profit, and that's a big myth. You can. And in fact, if you don't, your organization will fold. Because nobody likes to think about this, but the ugly truth is every single thing that your organization does, every single thing has a financial consequence to it. So if you're not building reserves and if you're not managing your money the same way you would manage your personal money, your nonprofit will fold. So nonprofits should be issuing financial statements monthly. Quick little, I'm going to go back and hit on something I touched about before already, where we had that client come to us where the board members were being held personally liable and there was no D&O insurance. Well, here was part of the problem. Their organization was not providing them with financial statements at all, ever. And so part of the problem was that the people coming after them said, hey, you had fiduciary responsibility, you're a board member, and you weren't even asking for financial statements. Shame on you, we're coming after you. So many of you on this call are familiar with for-profit financial statements, balance sheet, income statement, which I'm going to refer to as a P&L. Profit and loss is what that stands for, and a budget to actual report. Nonprofits have essentially the same thing, they're just called a different name. Since more people are familiar with the for-profit terminology, I'm going to use that for-profit terminology. So nobody, if I use the nonprofit terminology, usually I can see people thinking, oh, which one is that? What's she talking about? So I'm just going to use the for-profit terminology going forward. So this is the balance sheet. And if any of you were in the last webinar I did, I compared financial statements to LeBron James' career. So LeBron has a basketball season every year. During that season, the statisticians keep track of things like how many points he puts on the board, how many free throws he made, how many assists, etc. And then at the end of the season, LeBron's season stats go back to zero so he can start the next season all over again. But when his season stats go back to zero, they don't just disappear into the universe, they aggregate in with his career stats. So what you're looking at right now, the balance sheet is similar to LeBron James's career stats. Tells you what's been going on from the inception of the organization to date. Where you want to focus in on is the very bottom, net assets without and with donor restrictions. The riskiest area, or one of the riskiest areas for nonprofit, is this idea of keeping your donations in the right buckets as with or without donor restrictions. Magic word there is donor. Only donors can restrict money. Example, I give an organization that feeds homeless people. I give them money to build a kitchen. That's a donor restriction. They can't do anything with that money except build a kitchen. This is the P&L, and this is, in my analogy, this is LeBron's season stats right here. And so you can see that this particular P&L is split in columns without donor restrictions and with donor restrictions. And then there's a total and there's a comparison to the prior year. Somebody asked me once, what's that 20x2? The X2 is just a generic date. It's meant to be a year. It could be 2022 and 2021. So the X is just generic.
Jackie, a couple questions.
Mhm.
One is, does the fact that the 990s are automatically uploaded to GuideStar, etc., does that
Mhm.
satisfy the requirement for financial transparency, or do we need to show the 990 or other things on our website or somewhere else specific? And I have a follow-up question.
Super great question. My advice is that you have something on the website that says if you get an audit, audited financials available upon request or 990 available upon request. So my advice is you don't have it posted on your website, although you can, but you have verbiage that it's available upon request.
And I think we have a follow-up to the other question about financial statements. Should it be for the board or for everyone? Monthly financial statements, they're asking.
Well, so let me split hairs a little bit. I tend to use the expression monthly financials, and internally, monthly financials should be
We should.
provided definitely to the executive director. And if you're holding your department heads accountable to a budget, which you should be, they should get monthly financial statements as well. Board members don't necessarily need them monthly. They do need them every time there's a board meeting, and usually that's either every other month or quarterly, but they should be provided with those whenever there's a meeting. As far as to the general public, if you have a donor request them, give it to the donor, but you don't need to have your financial statements up on your website every single month. So certainly year-end financials is something that you'll give out more freely. So for example, if your year ends December, and somebody requests financials, you're probably not going to give them March. You're going to give them that previous year-end financial. It's more fair to you and to them to show a donor or a grantor 12 months of financials, because just like LeBron can have a bad game. That doesn't mean he's going to have a bad season. So your organization might have a bad quarter, but it doesn't mean you're going to have a bad season. Did I hit answer that, Lisa, or did I miss something?
I hope so. We'll see through the chat if Michael or Rick, are you guys okay? Yep, got one okay. Yep, think we're good. Yep.
So what's on the screen now is this budget to actual report, which is also incredibly critical that you watch this. So let me go back to my board members who were being sued because they never got anything, including a budget to actual. They couldn't look at it. They had no way of knowing that they didn't have D&O insurance. So when you have a budget to actual report, assuming you have been actively engaged in producing a meaningful budget and not just numbers that you get on a page, you'll be able to look at your budget to actual performance. And in my example of those other people, you'd go, we don't have any insurance expense and we've budgeted for insurance expense. What happened? Oh, we didn't renew our D&O. Well, let's renew the D&O. What are you doing? So your financials are really an objective representation of what's gone on in your organization, and they do tell a story. So the analogy I love to make with that one is all of us know, but I'm going to pick on myself, perception and reality are often different things. So last year, if I had talked to you in December, I would tell you about all the broccoli and carrots I was eating. And so how I was so proud of myself because it was the holidays and I was eating nothing but tofu, broccoli, and carrots. And then in January, I got on the scale, which reminded me that I had a lot of Christmas cookies and cakes and cinnamon rolls and all of those other things. I was not sticking to tofu, broccoli, and carrots. My perception was one thing, the reality was another thing. So your financial statements, and particularly but your budget to actual, is kind of like that scale in my example. Or if I didn't get on the scale, I noticed that my clothes weren't fitting as well. So that indicated I didn't eat just broccoli and tofu at the holiday time. So your budget versus actual is your objective representation to keep your perception based in reality a little bit. And if you're a board member, you should be looking at some of the swings. Now, let me define this. You don't care about $300 or $400 swings, even if you're an executive director or a budget manager. You don't care. But when those swings start to get into four and when they start getting commas in them, Now you're going to care a little bit more about those swings. And if you're a board member, your executive director, when this data is presented, should also be presenting data to you about how he or she has already determined what they're going to do going forward to correct the course. So this, going back to LeBron James, this is analogous to LeBron reviewing the footage of his games that he just played. Now, if LeBron waited until the end of the season to review his footage, the man would not be in the NBA anymore. He would have lost his career a long time ago, because by the end of the season, it's too late for him to do anything about it. And believe it or not, lots and lots of nonprofits don't look at their numbers until it's time to get ready for an audit. Well, guess what? It's too late. Instead, LeBron's looking at the game he might have played last night. He's looking at it today, making that up. I know he's not playing basketball right now, but he's looking at his footage today. And he's looking at his footage for two things: what he did right and what he did wrong, because he wants to do more of what he did right and he wants to correct what he did wrong. That's what this report is for nonprofit decision makers. It's LeBron's footage. What are you doing right? What are you doing wrong? I made the comment a couple minutes ago that just because your organization has a bad month or a bad quarter does not mean they're going to have a bad season. Unless you don't look at this and course correct, then you will have a bad season. So this is a critical tool. It's also part of those internal controls that I talked about that we're getting into right now. So what are internal controls? This is all the fancy stuff, but in the interest of time, I'm going to bring internal controls down to something we can all relate to. Every person on this call has locks on your door and locks on your windows. And you may have an alarm system, and you have ring doorbells or something like a ring doorbell. And you do that because you want to protect the people in your home and the valuable items, your TVs, your computers, those kinds of things. Locks on your doors and windows, security systems, and ring doorbells are internal controls. Internal controls. So your organization should have internal controls to not only protect its physical assets, like the money in its bank. There should be processes in place so that not anybody can sit down and write a check on your organization's bank account, but also to help prevent and catch errors. Because again, we're all human, we all make mistakes, but if you have good internal controls in place, those mistakes will be caught before bad decisions are made around bad data because a mistake happened and it wasn't caught. So your internal controls are also similar to, again, if you live with a partner right now and you share money, you share investments and bank accounts and so forth, probably one partner is the one writing the checks and investing the money and doing the heavy lifting on that. But the other partner is probably occasionally pulling up the checking account, taking a brief glance at it, pulling up the investment accounts, taking a brief glance at it. That's internal controls in your personal life, and your organization should have that as well. Here's some examples of internal controls. So the big one is segregation of duties, meaning the same person doesn't write the checks, put the money in the bank, and reconcile the bank accounts and do the payroll. Many nonprofits are small and they say, we don't have the budget to have 4 different people for all those positions. You're right. So there are what financial people call mitigating controls you can put in place to still have controls, even though maybe you can only afford to have one person do all those things. But certainly in a perfect world, the same person will not be doing all of that. Authorization controls means that nobody in your organization should just be able to go out and spend money. There should be an approval process, and the approval process should be a tiered approval process. So if I'm a budget manager, maybe I can spend money up to $5,000 and, approve it up to $5,000. If anything is spent beyond $5,000, maybe my VP needs to approve it. So that's an example of authorization controls. Access controls. So again, this is a lot about easy example. Not everyone in your organization should be an authorized signature on your bank account. Should only be a couple of people who are authorized signers on your bank account. Similarly, in your accounting data, not everyone in your organization should be able to process transactions in your accounting data. Now, budget managers, they should have all kinds of read-only access so that they can pull their reports and see how they're performing relative to their budget. But as far as inputting and processing financial transactions, it should be limited. Reconciliations are things like at the end of every month. We used to do this back in the day in our personal lives when we wrote checks. Most of us don't write checks anymore, but back in the day when we wrote checks, we would reconcile our checking account to our bank statement every single month and account for deposits we took to the bank that maybe didn't get processed by the bank till tomorrow, and account for checks that we wrote that maybe whoever got the check hadn't cashed it yet. So that's a reconciliation of our records to the bank's records. Similarly, in your nonprofit organization, you should be reconciling most of your balance sheet accounts every single month. And then, of course, I touched on physical safeguards. If your organization does still write checks, and some do, you should have them locked up in an office or a file cabinet with only one or two people who have the key and the access to those checks. If you have vehicles in your organization, they should be locked in a garage every night. Simple, common sense things.
Jackie, question.
Mhm. Mhm.
Could you say a little more about mitigating controls for small organizations?
Mhm. One mitigating control, which is why I tried to emphasize it, hopefully I did, is that budget to actual report. If it's being reviewed, seriously reviewed, not just, oh yeah, okay, I got it, boom. But if somebody's actually looking at those variances, that's a mitigating control. Another type of mitigating control is if you have, one person doing the payroll, putting the money in the bank, writing the checks, all that. Another mitigating control is the executive director, vice president, somebody is reviewing the payroll before it's actually submitted to pay people. That's a mitigating control. Or you have your main accountant doing the bank reconciliation and somebody else reviews that bank reconciliation. And of course, I would be remiss to say a big, gigantic mitigating control is to outsource part of your accounting, part or all of your accounting. By definition, we're a big mitigating control because we don't have a pony in the race or whatever that expression is. So those are examples of a few mitigating controls. There are many, many more. And mitigating controls are as unique to an organization as the kind of shoes you like are to you. We all like different kind of shoes. We all have personal taste, and mitigating controls are different depending on your particular organization. Another important thing is that as leaders, you should set the proper tone at the top. So this expression got a lot of traction for those of you who are old enough to remember the Enron disaster, when the time Enron was the biggest bankruptcy this country had experienced. And one of the many, many, many problems at Enron was that particularly the one person in charge, Jeff Skilling, just did not set the right example for the company. This is very, very similar to you as a parent. If you're telling your children not to lie, steal, and cheat, and you're going out and lying, stealing, and cheating, you're not setting a good tone at the top. So it's critical for you as a decision maker to demonstrate integrity and act with the highest ethics at all times. Now, that I'm going to tell you, that doesn't, from personal experience, there are times on the inside I'm boiling mad and I want to do crazy, crazy things because I'm so angry, but I don't execute on those crazy things. I don't throw my computer against the window and set bad examples. I take a deep breath, go for a walk on a beautiful day like today, and calm down. So, of course, you can have those angry emotions, but setting the proper tone at the top means not expressing them in front of your staff and always acting with ethics and integrity. So there's a number of policies that are excellent to have in your organization. These two in particular, the 990 asks if the tax return 990 asks if you have them. People always think because the 990 asks you have to have them. No, you don't. But certainly they're good best practices. So the conflict of interest policy we already talked about. The second policy is a whistleblower policy. So that's the policy that says, hey, if you're an employee, a vendor, anybody who does business with us and you think some funny business is going on, here's an email or a phone number or however you want to set it up that you can report it anonymously and it will be investigated. So I'm going to dispel another myth. Many of you who are forced to go through an audit, it's a common myth that, oh, we don't have to worry about, you know, inappropriate anything because we have an audit every year. So here we go. I'm going to blow your minds. Auditors are not in the business of detecting fraud. Auditors are not in the business of detecting fraud, and they will not typically. And they will tell you this. And I've said this in front of them, and they have agreed with me. And they love that I say it because everybody thinks they will find fraud if there is some. No, they will not. And over 50% of the fraud that is found because somebody blew the whistle. So, going back to auditors to cut them a little slack here, they're not in the business to detect fraud, but they are in the business to look at your financial statements and prove that the numbers you have on there that you're giving out to the IRS and grantors and donors are materially correct. That's what they're in the business to do. Yes, these numbers are materially correct. Now, if on the way to proving those numbers are materially correct, if they find fraud, they'll certainly report it to the board, to the executive director, etc. Yes, they will bring that to your attention, but they're unlikely to find it without a whistleblower. So there are laws and regulations that as a nonprofit you have to uphold. So certainly number one is the IRS. And we talked about that, even though you're generally, and some of you can argue with me about this and you would be right, but inside the bell curve, you're generally not paying income taxes, but you do have to file an informational tax return. If you are actively soliciting donors, you will be subject to the state's charitable solicitation laws. This is the laws that sometimes, depending on your revenue threshold, require an audit. So if you are soliciting donations and you don't have a charitable solicitation license, I encourage you to get on your state's website and look up the rules around that. As a board member or a decision maker, you do need to make sure that your organization is following the laws and its bylaws. Audits, as a decision maker, you need to make sure that these are happening in a timely manner. And again, usually the requirement for audits are dictated by one of three things. Either the charitable solicitation laws in your state, if your organization has any loans, sometimes your lenders require an audit. And if your organization has grants, and usually they're the larger grants, your grantor, your large grantors may require an audit. How do you know? You have to read the contracts. You have to read the charitable solicitation laws. You have to read your loan contract. You have to read your grant contracts and see if they call for an audit.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, there's rules in 49 states. Notice I said 49, not 50, called MIFA. The one state that doesn't have MIFA laws is Pennsylvania. So MIFA guides your organization's investments. And specifically, if you have any endowments, otherwise known as permanently restricted money. So if you have any of that, your organization has some decisions to make around those endowments. How much of the investment earnings can you spend every year? Where is it invested? How are you diversifying the portfolio, etc.? Those decisions must be in compliance with your state's MIFA laws. Unless, of course, you're in Pennsylvania, then you don't have MIFA laws, but all the rest do.
We have two follow-up questions, Jackie.
Mhm.
Um, is it possible to have too many mitigating controls and not realize it as an organization? And can too many controls in place cause inefficiencies and confusion to the financial goal?
Person who asked this question is going to regret it because this is going to get me off on a soapbox. Yes. So here's what I commonly see in nonprofits. It's very common for nonprofits to have accounting software that's vintage 1989. And I'm only exaggerating a bit. And the reason they do that is back then the software was very expensive. It was $50,000 investment, and it's not an area you want to spend your money. So they got it in 1989. They kept using it. So, and I am getting to that point, Lisa. So I'm just going to tell you right now, software is very, very, very affordable, much less than $50,000 a year. So if your organization is stuck in 1989 technology, please look into upgrading to something more current, and we can help you with that. But here's the point about, can you have too many mitigating controls? Yes, yes, yes. And we see it all the time. Because back in the technological era of 1989, and even before that, when we were using ledger paper and abacuses in my case, you had a lot of things happening because it was so hard to get information out of the computer. So if I bought a stapler for my organization, it would need Lisa's approval.
Mm-hmm.
And then Leslie might put it into the accounting software, but it
Mm-hmm.
would hang in limbo in the accounting software. And then Janie would look at what Leslie did and make sure it was accurate. And then if Janie decided it was accurate, Susie would look at what
Mm-hmm.
Janie had done and Leslie had done and decide it was accurate and properly approved. And then the button would get pushed and it would get into the accounting software. And then a report would print out, print, literally print. And Chuck would review the report to make sure it was consistent with what Susie, Janie, and Leslie had done, which was consistent with the stapler invoice that I put in that Lisa approved.
Mm-hmm.
In that day and age, those controls were appropriate because software wasn't as friendly as it is today. Fast forward, we now have software where in 2 clicks of a mouse, I can have ice cream delivered at my door in 2 hours. And we have the accounting version of that. Some organizations have updated to the latest and greatest software, which is awesome, but they still have controls in place like they're using 1989 software.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just did an analysis of a client, a brand new client, who has 5 people, five, approving and checking the same data before it's actually posted. And we said, what are you doing? Stop this. You're wasting time, you're wasting energy. Here's another part of my rant with this. Oftentimes, organizations have departments keeping their own Excel spreadsheets on what's going on. They're not relying on the accounting data. Why? because the accountants are so far behind. Why? Because you have five people putting eyes on one transaction before it's ever posted. So this is a snowball effect. It's not only wasting the accountant's time, but it's wasting the department's manager's time because they're keeping their own set of manual books because the accounting department is so backed up. So yes, it is absolutely possible to have too many controls that result in inefficiencies. Yes.
We have two more questions if we can get them in quickly.
Sure.
Aaron, thank you for posting about the charitable solicitation licensing website. So please, if you all haven't looked at the chat, there's a link in there for that for more information. So thank you. One is I think it's soliciting the same as a grant request. That's one.
I'm going to defer to the lawyers on that. You've got to look at your state's charitable solicitation laws and see how they define it. Typically, this is not
Not the
100%.
same. Mhm.
Typically, it means when you're asking people to donate money. So a grant request is different, but
Okay.
you got to refer to the charitable solicitation license. I don't know if I raised my hand, Lisa. I didn't mean to, but
I think
there's a
you raised your
hand.
hand.
Okay. I didn't
Okay.
mean
Do you have a
to.
question?
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more. If an endowment is held at a community foundation, can we trust that they meet, now I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing the word, MIF,
Mifa.
UMMIFA on our
Mhm.
behalf?
No, you can never trust anybody. But trust but verify is the old expression. Again, typically community foundations, yes, they do uphold all of those MIFA laws, typically.
Okay.
But here was the problem with Enron. We all trusted that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, and they weren't. So if you have an endowment with a community foundation, certainly there is somebody there that you can ask if they're upholding up MIFA laws. Just as importantly, they should be able to provide you a copy of their policies for distributing the earnings on that so you can see if it's in compliance with that MIFA. But I will warn you, MIFA is largely a legal issue, so whether or not an organization is in compliance comes down to the lawyers. But short of the lawyers, you can certainly, within reasonableness, guess, and you can certainly ask the community foundation, and they should be able to tell you.
You're good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for the time today. I appreciate it. Oh, if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me as well, and I'll answer questions unique to you via email.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining. This was a very important webinar, especially now and the way things are going today. Please make sure your financial controls and everything that we've gone through today with Jackie, you're double checking and triple checking. Great. Thank you so much, Jackie. I appreciate you being here
Thank you,
today.
everyone.
Thank you.